Jordan Peterson has recently come out with a very controversial claim that there is really no good argument for atheism. In today's video, we're going to be analyzing his discussion with Matt Fradd and giving you our thoughts on it.
I don't think there is a good argument for atheism. I think it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the world. So it's just, it's what would you say? It's an illegal chess move.
Okay.
That's an interesting point, and I think this might summarize his whole argument here. He says atheism is an illegal chess move. Now, what exactly does this mean? What does it mean that it's a mistaken understanding of the world? Well, I think this is one of those places where people like to jump on and criticize Jordan Peterson because, well, no one really understands what he actually means by making these statements. Because a legal chess move would seem to say that atheism is itself a jump in logic. It's not even a jump in logic, but it's almost atheism itself is structurally a logical fallacy. That seems to be what he means by it is a legal chess move. But really, is atheism really a logical fallacy, intrinsically a logical fallacy? Because what he seems to be suggesting here is not just, well, okay, I've made an argument X, Y, Z, that argument isn't very good. What he's making a stronger argument to say, well, X, Y, Z isn't even a logically valid argument to make. And that does seem to be quite a strong statement, which I'm not sure whether I would agree with, because you could look at things like the problem of evil, or you could look at things like, I don't know, divine hiddenness, which don't seem to entail or include any logical fallacies, at least at face value. So I'm not really sure exactly whether Jordan Peterson is correct.
Best argument for atheism.
What's the best
materialistic,
of the worst
materialistic determinism is the best argument for atheism.
But isn't that a philosophical sort of assumption or axiom?
That's a problem.
Now, of course, materialistic determinism, he says, is the best argument for atheism. I don't want to jump too quickly to disagree with him, because I do think if someone starts from a materialistic deterministic perspective, you actually do get atheism quite strongly, or at least a very strong form of agnosticism, because, well, if you start from the assumption that, well, all we have is a materialistic universe, and all of our thoughts and actions and everything in the world is fully determined, then, well, not only do you lead to some form of epistemic kind of challenge to actually demonstrate the proof of the supernatural, but you would get to a stance where it's almost an epistemic kind of collapse, or a modal collapse, where whether you are a theist or not is completely unrelated to whether it's true or not, but rather every proposition you adhere to is not based on reason, but purely based on a deterministic framework. So I do think this would be the strongest challenge to atheism, to theism, but I'm not really sure whether that's something an atheist would go down, because, well, kind of as Matt Fradd properly notes, that's almost just like saying, well, okay, I'm just going to assume that God doesn't exist, and that's somewhat circular in reasoning.
Because they're perfectly rational if you accept the initial axiom, but I don't accept the initial axiom.
What's the original?
Like I said, it's something like a materialist determinism.
And also, let's turn to what he talks about material determinism here for a second. He does say, well, all right, an only rational way would be start off from material determinism and use that as an axiom. But surely there are other ways in which an atheistic case can be made. For example, the problem of evil doesn't necessarily start from materialistic determinism. Someone doesn't need to have the axiom of materialistic determinism to pose the problem of evil or pose the problem of divine hiddenness. So the idea that all of the arguments for atheism is fundamentally a result of an axiomatic structure which starts from materialistic determinism doesn't seem correct here. So I do think perhaps there's places where Jordan Peterson is wrong in this video, and perhaps he has to kind of move away from the axiomatic approach to atheism to recognize that some of the atheist challenges don't start off from the assumption that God doesn't exist or God cannot exist, but from the assumption that, like, let's take, for example, ex hypothesi that, I butchered that, my throat is kind of dead, but if someone, let's go with the hypothesis that God exists, there's some internal inconsistency there with the world that we see. So some of the arguments, some of the axioms or the frameworks that atheists provide doesn't stem from materialistic determinism, but rather from actually just internal arguments of internal incoherency, like the problem of evil, the logical problem of evil being the best example of that.
All right, I'm open to believing in God or not believing in God, and I've seen no good evidence or arguments for God's existence.
It's like I said, it's an illegal game move. See, the problem with that argument is that it's an atheist argument right from the beginning. Well, what's the evidence? It's like, belief in God is not propositional acceptance of a set of descriptive facts. That's not what it is. It's commitment.
So there is a kind of a distinction. This is where people also push Jordan Peterson a lot on, where he says, well, what does believe actually mean? He's making a very strong actually argument in a fideist kind of tradition to say, well, looking for an argument for God is itself a wrong jump. And now, of course, the way he presents it as this logical kind of lapse or this kind of illegal jump might be a bit too strong. But in the fideist tradition, they would say, well, all right, coming to God has to purely be from faith alone, and the pursuit of evidence itself is an irrational movement. Now, is that illogical or kind of a logical lapse or a legal move? That might be too strong of a category, but nonetheless, there is a tradition which does support what Jordan Peterson is saying. Furthermore, there is kind of this case where what Jordan Peterson means by belief is fundamentally different from what a lot of atheists and scholars discuss about, well, does God exist? And he does raise a good point, which says, well, even if God does exist, even the devils believe in God, and therefore belief that God exists isn't sufficient for faith. But as Matt Fradd rightly notes, I think, is that belief in God is somewhat still important in the movement towards the existence of God or a relationship with God. If you accept that God exists, then surely you might want to have a relationship with him, or you might not want to have a relationship with him. But if you can't even establish that God exists in the first place, then, well, who exactly are you having that relationship to? And I think that's a question of Matt Fradd in this question. And as you can see here, I do admire and respect Matt Fradd for kind of giving pushback here, because he does look very concerned and get very confused here. So there is a disagreement here, which is quite interesting.
So if God does exist, surely I need some kind of reason to think this isn't just a story I'm telling myself.
Conscience. Where does that pesky little thing come from?
I think there's three options.
Okay.
One might be, we evolved this way.
That's fine. I'm perfectly happy with that explanation.
But here's my problem with that. Yeah, because if you say, okay, if we were raping and pillaging, we would have never gotten this far as a species. Therefore, these things have become taboo or something like that, which is a far cry from saying they're somehow objectively wrong or mind independently evil.
I don't know. It's not so far. It's not so far. No, I think the evolutionary biology and the religious will dovetail perfectly.
Well, okay, but then here's the thing:
God is the deepest instinct.
If I now know that it's evolution that's wired me thus, I can choose to disobey it. It's lower than me. I could be Raskolnikov, presumably. I can go against it.
Of course.
And another source would be individuals. Like you could tell me I'm a bad person to do X, Y, or Z, or praise me if I do other things, and I might feel good or feel bad. Or collectively as society, you can say this.
Yeah.
But just as you have no right, it seems to me, to determine how I ought to live, collectively, why would you have any more authority?
That's Raskolnikov's argument too.
So it seems,
or the Marquis de Sade.
So this objective morality could come from beneath us in evolution, from outside of us on our level.
Yeah.
Maybe it comes from above us. And then it's like, okay, if it comes from above us, is it in some sort of platonic form? And if it is a platonic form, is there a commandment being issued? And why do I need to be obedient to a platonic form,
so you don't end up in hell?
It's an interesting thing, because it seems like the discussion has moved completely beyond the propositional debate about whether God exists or not. Now, of course, Jordan Peterson then says, well, the existence of the consciousness is evidence for the divine. But at the same time, when Matt Fradd then gives a kind of a naturalistic explanation for evolution, then Jordan Peterson says, well, okay, the naturalistic explanation kind of dovetails with the theistic one, and they're kind of the same, and they kind of support each other towards this divine reality, or this divine moral order. Now, of course, the extent of the metaphysical kind of implications of what Jordan Peterson is trying to say by saying, well, they kind of dovetail together in his support for this evolutionary biologist perspective of morals is kind of an interesting one, and I'm not sure whether they go in depth about it. But nonetheless, I do think there is a point where there is kind of this development of the argument away from the propositional. Of course, you could say, well, if conscience exists, this is like the William Lane Craig or a moral argument to say, if objective moralities exist, then God exists. Objective moralities exist, therefore God exists. That's kind of the argument for that. But at the same time, there doesn't seem to be an initial kind of reason for why one should accept this kind of if objective morality exists over anything else, because even when Matt Fradd's pushing Jordan Peterson to say, well, actually, why do you think that this objective morality exists? All Jordan Peterson says is, well, it seems intuitively the case that it's better than the worst one, and you actually can go do the worst things. You can go for disorder, and, well, you will see what happens if you do disorder. But then that doesn't exactly give any normative value to why you should do the good, apart from the fact that, oh, well, you might just not like it at the end. But what if someone likes it? Well, then they kind of drag themselves to hell. That's the example of Jordan Peterson is saying, well, these people are going to kind of throw the burning coals over their own heads, right? Well, all right, if someone does go down that route, does go down kind of a devilish route, then, well, actually, what does that lead to? And there's kind of that question of, well, if we are accepting everything Jordan Peterson is saying, that someone can actually go do evil stuff and can do disorder, some people can do good and go to heaven, some people can just follow evolutionary biology, and they all seem to be kind of possible or plausible routes for the human condition, then, well, has he actually even established objective morality in the first place? Or more specifically, has he even established normative objective morality? And, well, that's an interesting question here.
And to think of the psyche, let's say the Father, as a representation of the highest spirit, it's not prima facie absurd. It's not a bad metaphor. So I'll give you an example of that. So imagine all the admirable men you've ever known.
doing it now.
Okay. Well, they have a unity, right? It's the unity of whatever makes them admirable.
Yeah.
Right. So they all reflect the same spirit. Seriously, they're all approximations to the same spirit. Well, what's that spirit? What's the God of Abraham? That's what it is. This is a definition.
Yeah, all right.
So God is the benevolence that shines through the good Father. It's a definition. Just like God is the call to adventure, or just like God is conscience. And you think, well, that's not God. It's like, well, have it your way. Like, you're playing games.
This is where I think Matt Fradd actually raises a very interesting point, because, of course, in the 19th century, you had a guy called Feuerbach who then argued that all of religion, all of theology is a result of anthropology. So when you say God is love, you're talking about God as literally by definition, the highest principle of love from a human perspective. Same with if God is this kind of principle of goodness, God is the sum or the definition of what we mean by human goodness. Now, in some sense, that's actually very similar to what Jordan Peterson says. You can have this kind of definitional usage of God to just define God as adventure, define God as the highest state of consciousness, define God as the good, without actually there being a metaphysical supernatural God there, because all you would then have is just the good, the consciousness, all of these different terms which you are defining as God with, and those would be the terms which you then classify as God. It doesn't mean God actually exists, in the same way that if I said, okay, everything that I have on my table, my nail clippers, my pens, all of these things are what I call an apple. Well, yes, I have an apple which exists here, but does an apple actually exist? No, I don't have an apple in my hand. So in some sense, you could say that Jordan Peterson is falling very close to this kind of religious anthropology in a Feuerbachian sense, which is quite an interesting thing. And I suppose it'll be curious to see how much of kind of 19th century theology Jordan Peterson has actually interacted with, because in some sense, he is very much a 19th century thinker, kind of because psychoanalysis came out of the 19th century, but nonetheless, I do think there's an interesting point that he raises, but there are implications which most Christians would probably disagree with. And I think Matt Fradd is exactly presenting this right now.
And so a reflection of something real. And you might say, well, not transcendentally real. It's like, well, why not? Okay. Why not transcendentally real? Yeah. What do you think? We're made in opposition to the spirit of the natural order? Is that your theory? Or we're random? Really? Random. That's your theory, is it? That's not a very smart theory.
Okay.
There's nothing random. There's some random mutation, and even that's not true. There's a hierarchy of mutational repair.
No.
Yeah, well, this has been discovered quite recently. Mutation is random. No, turns out that's not true, because mutations that occur to genes that are crucial for survival are repaired with 100% accuracy. There's some room for experimentation out in the margins, but not at the center, just like in life itself. Mm-hmm. It's like, and whatever shaped us isn't random. The mutation process, part of it is random. And I suppose we capitalize on chance, but as an explanation for the nature of being itself, it's like, no one knows how life arose. No one knows anything about consciousness. Yeah. Not the least. It's a byproduct of neural activity. It's why isn't your solar plexus conscious then?
Yeah.
Right? You've got neurons galore. There's more neurons in your autonomic nervous system than there are in your central nervous system. It's not conscious. It's not neural activity per se. And most neural activity in your cerebral cortex isn't conscious. What the hell's consciousness? It's the spirit of God that what would you say, broods upon the
face of the waters.
That's
baby.
Right. That's what consciousness is.
Yeah.
That's as good a definition as any. In fact, it's the best definition I've ever seen.
Also,
man has become very, very slippery, this Mr. Jordan Peterson, and in a good sense. And he doesn't really answer much of the questions that Matt Fradd's arguing. In fact, I think this is the problem when anyone asks Jordan Peterson, do you believe in God, or do you think there's a good argument for the existence of God? He always kind of slips out of it with his psychoanalytical analysis that I was kind of alluding to, and also his kind of argument. So by definition, these things are what and what. And of course, I think there's merit to that viewpoint. I think there's reason for Jordan Peterson to accept it. I do think if you approach it from the perspective of psychoanalysis alone, that is kind of the world that you do indeed get. That's a framework that you get. But of course, as kind of ontologists or philosophers of religion, there also is a claim which Jordan Peterson doesn't really touch upon, which is, well, does God actually exist as kind of this supernatural reality? Now, towards the end of this video, this rant that he just gave, he does indeed raise a very fine-tuning-esque argument, or a very kind of design-esque argument to say, well, what you see is definitely not random and is a result of an intricate kind of web of development and mutations and cannot just be seen as random. And that's definitely kind of a pseudo-design argument or a pseudo-fine-tuning argument that he provides. But nonetheless, there is still that gap which exists between what he says is atheism, what he says is arguments for atheism, and what a lot of people in the philosophy of religion say is atheism. And that's kind of, I think, the clash that Matt Fradd and kind of Jordan Peterson are kind of clashing over. So I hope you've enjoyed this analysis. Hope you found it helpful. I know there's a lot to cover here, but I hope this kind of is not kind of over your heads, and hope I've kind of touched this very well. Stay safe, you enjoy this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more videos on this channel. And I'll see you soon.